Hi there, this video is going to discuss the fall of the ancient nations of Israel and Judah. So, for about 60 to 70 years after Solomon's death, and after the single nation of Israel split into two, Israel and Judah fought with each other. And both of them ended up losing territory that David had gained. So remember, Israel is at its biggest, at its most powerful, at its most peaceful when David is king. And they also struggled with other nations that surrounded them, but none of those nations was ever particularly powerful enough to take them over completely. And even when they weren't directly fighting, they were kind of plotting against each other. And had Egypt or one of the other Mesopotamian nations like Moab, Phoenicia, Syria, been strong at this time, Israel and Judah would probably have been conquered and completely taken over. By about 850 BC, the fighting stops, but injustice still continues. So rich people are getting richer, but poor people are getting poorer. And this seems to have been worse in the north, but was bad in both the north and the south. And the prophets were people who criticized that injustice. And we'll talk more about how the prophets did that later in this unit. But prophets were the people who were standing up saying, no, this is not right. By about 800 to 750 BC, things have kind of settled down a little bit. Israel and Judah were both fairly prosperous. There's a time of peace. They're trading both with each other and with surrounding nations, and there's wealth. So archaeologists have found evidence of great prosperity. So fancy homes, ivory furnishings, evidence of gold and silver being traded for other things, evidence of interior decorating, kind of fancy military uniforms and chariots. So all of those things indicate kind of prosperity and wealth. Despite that, there's still injustice. That was evident. So Israelites continue to worship foreign gods, and the prophets continue to warn that destruction was coming if people fail to obey the covenant. And the situation in Judah really seems to be a little more static at this time, but just kind of will start to go down. So the injustice seems a little more apparent in Israel, but that'll change in Judah kind of the later we get in the time period in this unit. So next I want you to think about being at the beach. Right? It's a nice hot day. You're sitting on the sand, watching the waves come in. And the thing about waves is as one wave comes in and crashes, there's another wave right behind it. This is really how I think about world history and empires. So, for example, world history is really just a series of one nation being very powerful, and then just like a wave gets very big and then crashes, that empire gets very big and very powerful and crashes. And there's another wave right behind that first wave to take its place. And that wave gets very big and powerful until it crashes. And then there's another wave right behind it. And history kind of works the same way, where we see in ancient history a series of empires, one right after the other. So one empire is very powerful for a time, then fades, then another empire grows to be very powerful, then it fades, and then another empire grows to be very powerful, and it fades. And that metaphor is kind of important to understanding what happens with the nations of Israel and Judah. So by about 745 BC, the nation of Assyria was very powerful. So their wave is, coming up and is nice and big. And Israel and Judah both had very weak kings. And remember earlier we said, Israel and Judah were weak, and if another surrounding nation had been pretty strong, they would have been taken over. Well, here's kind of that situation. Israel joins an alliance of nations against the Assyrians. The Assyrians invade and demand tribute. The king of Israel agrees, but then goes back on the deal. So in 721, the emperor of Assyria conquers Israel. And the nation of Israel becomes a province of the nation of Assyria. So people were resettled and get intermarried. So the term of the lost tribes of Israel kind of refers to the 10 tribes that had formed the nation of Israel really disappear because the people get intermarried with the Assyrians and kind of lose their identity as Israelites. And so for you, it's important to know the ancient nation of Israel, after 721, no longer exists. There's no more nation of Israel until we get the modern nation of Israel established in the 1940s. Now, Judah kind of sees what's happening to Israel, and King Ahaz of Judah refused to join that initial alliance and refused to rebel against Assyria. And he violated the covenant with Yahweh to try and save Judah. So he built an altar and sacrificed his sons, he's trying to do whatever he can to save the country. Later kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, attempt to kind of bring people back in line with the covenant. Hezekiah, for example, is a strong military leader. He stops the tribute, stops paying money to the Assyrians and stops foreign worship. King Josiah, when King Josiah is king, the Hilkiah, the high priest, finds this book of law and brings it to Josiah, and Josiah is so overtaken by this book of law, which scholars think was probably the book of Deuteronomy. He brings it out to the people and says, "People, we haven't been following this. This is horrible. We need to follow this right now." And so both of those kings attempted to bring reform to the country of Judah, but we'll see their efforts were not enough. And so, just like the Assyrian wave got really powerful, it started to go downhill and crash a little bit, and next comes the Babylonian wave. So the Babylonians replaced the Assyrians as the major power in the area, and in 598 the Babylonians invade Judah, send the royal family into exile, and in 587 they conquer Judah completely. A couple very, very important things happen at this time. They destroy the temple, and they send most people into exile. So when we talk about the Babylonian exile, this is what we're talking about. And you send people into exile because if you just conquered them and left them alone, they would be more likely to rebel against you and cause you problems. So the Babylonians moved many of the citizens of Judah to Babylon. They didn't move everyone. They moved mostly the leaders. And so those who were left had a local governor who was eventually assassinated. And so in 582, the rest of the leaders were moved, country divided. Basically, everyone in Judah feels abandoned in some way. So the people who are left behind in Judah feel abandoned. The people who are taken into exile feel abandoned, and many of them are dispersed. The Jews that were sent to Babylon had some measure of freedom. They weren't slaves as they had been in Egypt during Moses' time, but they were treated as lower class citizens. And one of the biggest things that happens, biggest developments here, is that the Jews face a gigantic identity crisis. Who are we religiously? Was Yahweh powerful? Was Yahweh even there? Yahweh's temple just got completely destroyed by the Babylonians. And remember, that temple was the one place for the one God. So where is our one God? Does that mean God has completely abandoned us? Does that mean God doesn't even exist? Why are we suffering so much? These are the kinds of questions that Jews were asking. And the next big question is, how do we stay together as Jews? Before this, Jews identified as Jews by worshiping at the temple. You had priests taking care of the temple, making sacrifices at the temple. You went to the temple to pray. With no temple, you can't make sacrifices just at any old place because the temple was the one place for the one God. And you're scattered anyway. You can't go to Jerusalem. Even if you were in Jerusalem, there's no temple for you to go to. So how do you show that you're still faithful to Yahweh? So the religion evolves in two very, very, very important ways, and this really is the root of modern Judaism. The first is that people begin to gather together to worship. So this is the start of the synagogue. So they gather in tents to share their stories of faith and pray together. The Babylonians didn't care that they did that. So we have the kind of precursor to the synagogue, that practice that starts here of gathering together to share stories and worship. And if you remember back in Genesis, we talked about 4 groups of writers, J, E, D, and P. The P writers were part of the group that was sent into exile. So the P writers write down their own version of stories of faith, and they finish Torah. So that's the second big development here, that we have this concept of praying together and Torah is finished. And in some ways, the scattering never stops. So the diaspora is the scattering of Jews following the Babylonian in exile. So in class, we'll look at some different maps of Israel and Judah, and we'll also look at how the Jews reacted to being sent into exile. And then later in the unit, we'll take a look at what the prophets had to say about all of this historical development. So see you then.